What everyone saw as junk, she saw as a chance to get rich. Sarah Harrison was 42 years old, with calloused hands and a proposal that made the most influential man in the district laugh in her face. She wanted to buy what was left of a demolished factory. Pieces of concrete, twisted rebar, bricks broken in half. All of it things nobody wanted anymore. What she didn't tell anyone was the real reason. Since the night before, she hadn't been able to sleep. She lay in bed with her eyes on the ceiling, running calculations in her head, trying to control her breathing, trying not to let hope grow too fast, because she had learned in the hard life she'd led that hope that grows too fast hurts the most when it crumbles. The old grain processing plant sat at the end of the dirt road that cut through Dusty Creek. It had run for 50 years. Then it closed. Then it rotted. And when the heirs decided to sell the land, they hired an outside company to demolish what was left of the structure. In 2 days, a concrete wall that had withstood half a century of sun and rain turned to dust and rubble. All that was left was a pile. Sarah was driving by when the trucks were still working. She pulled over to the shoulder and sat staring through the window, not like someone looking at a ruin, like someone seeing something others hadn't spotted yet. She parked the car, got out and stood at the edge of the lot with the wind hitting her face. The leather apron she wore at work was folded on the back seat. She had just come back from a job where she helped sort debris for reuse, work she'd been doing for over 15 years. Her eyes were trained. And what they saw in that pile wasn't trash. They were solid bricks, the kind they don't make anymore. The old mortar holding them together was different, thicker, but she knew how to remove it without breaking the brick. There were beams of wood darkened by time, protected inside by the plaster. And along the edges, where the concrete had chipped when it fell, fragments of stonework appeared in the foundations. Stones that the local market looked for and rarely found. Sarah left without talking to anyone that night, but she came back the next day. The land belonged to George Sterling. Everyone in Dusty Creek knew George, owner of a general store, a small hauling company, and a big chunk of the land on the north end of the district. A 60-year-old man with a big belly, who wore a dress shirt even on hot days and liked people to know who they were dealing with. He wasn't bad, wasn't good. He was the kind who smiles when there's an advantage and disappears when there isn't. Sarah scheduled a meeting with him in the store office. She arrived right on time, with a file of papers she'd put together herself, including photos of the lot taken with her cell phone and a proposal printed on a folded sheet of paper. She was wearing her usual denim shirt, the brown leather apron tied in front, her blonde hair in a simple bun. Her face showed she lived outdoors, a tired but steady glow. George received the proposal, opened the page, read the number, and looked up at her with that smile she already knew. The smile of someone who finds it funny. "You want to pay me that for that pile of junk?" he asked slowly, as if talking to someone who didn't quite understand. "That's what it's worth," Sarah answered, without blinking. "Sarah, how long have you been in construction?" he asked. 15 years. "Then you know that stuff is useless to anyone. It's junk. I'll have to pay to get it hauled away. Then sell it to me, and you won't have to pay to haul it." He stared at her for a moment, then let out a short laugh, as if that were the best deal of the day. He took the proposal and signed it, had an employee make a copy. "Go ahead then. Good luck with your pile of rocks." Sarah picked up the paper, folded it carefully, and put it in her file. She left the office without hurrying. Only when she got into the car and closed the door did she let the air out of her chest all at once, as if she had been holding her breath throughout the entire conversation. She had a week to start removing the material, and she had no one to help. The next morning she arrived at the lot before sunrise. The cornfield next door was still dark, only the horizon line starting to turn orange. She got out of the car with her cell phone flashlight on, put on her leather apron, pulled the first bricks with her hands, and began. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, feel free to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us beginners a lot. Now continuing, the first days were ones of silence and solitude. Sarah worked from dawn until mid-morning, rested 2 hours on the car seat because she didn't want to leave and come back, and resumed until late afternoon. She sorted the bricks by size and condition, stacked them methodically, creating rows that slowly grew alongside the dark wooden shed that stood in the corner of the lot, still upright despite the demolition. During those hours of quiet work, her mind wandered to places she usually avoided. It went to her father. Mr. Arthur Harrison had been a mason for nearly 40 years. He started as a boy, an apprentice to an uncle who built simple houses in the countryside, and he learned through touch, patience, and the weight of things. When Sarah was 8 years old, her mother had a lot to do at home and had nowhere to leave the youngest, so Mr. Arthur took his daughter along to the construction site. Sarah would sit on a concrete block, watching her father work, and he would explain everything in that measured voice of someone who believes everything has importance. "This brick here, Sarah, listen to the sound it makes." He would tap it with his knuckle, and it would sound solid, firm. A good brick sounds different from a bad brick. A bad brick is hollow, it echoes empty. A good brick has a full belly. She learned to hear bricks before she learned to read properly. She learned to tell old mortar from new by its smell, to recognize hardwood by its weight and the texture of its grain when she ran her hand over it, to identify cut stone by its color and grain, traits no book teaches, but that the eyes imprint when one pays attention. Mr. Arthur left when she was 26. One morning he simply didn't wake up. Sarah was called by her sister Margaret, and when she arrived at her parents' house, he was already lying there with that peace of someone who left without suffering, without warning, without a goodbye. She never managed to say goodbye properly, and she had carried that in a way she herself couldn't name. It wasn't just longing, it was also the feeling of having an inheritance that no one saw, that she carried in her whole body, in her hands and eyes, and that the world rarely valued, until now. The neighbors passed by on the road and stared. Some stopped their cars, got out, tried to understand what she was doing. "Are you going to sell that to who, Sarah?" asked Old Man Miller, a white-haired gentleman who lived across the street and was used to seeing everything that happened on that corner. "To whoever needs it, old man." "But who's going to want to buy rubble?" "It's not rubble. It's building material." The old man looked at the pile, looked at her, and shook his head with that expression of someone who doesn't want to argue but also doesn't agree. He left. Sarah watched his silhouette disappear down the road and felt something she recognized as determination, not anger, not hurt. That quiet, steady thing that kept her going even when no one understood. What weighed heaviest wasn't the bricks. It was what people said. And the worst didn't come from strangers. It came from Margaret. Margaret Harrison was 5 years older than Sarah and always acted as if that difference were a permanent hierarchy. She had married David Miller, owner of a grocery store in the nearest town, and since then had lived convinced that she had climbed the social ladder in a way her sister never had. They lived in a large brick house with a front garden, had a late model car, and Margaret liked to mention these things in conversation, like one mentions the weather, with a casualness that wasn't natural. When Margaret found out about the deal with George's land, she didn't call Sarah. She went in person to Miller's grocery and told the story out loud for anyone who wanted to hear. "My sister bought the rubble from the old factory. She paid money for rubble. My mother must be turning over in her grave. Someone at the counter asked why she had done it. Beats me," Margaret said. "She never left that place. That's just who she is." That remark reached Sarah 3 days later, through a mutual acquaintance who thought she was doing her a favor by passing it along, and the remark settled on her like a weight. It wasn't new. Margaret always had a version of Sarah that was smaller than she really was, but hearing it like that, second-hand, with the cruelty diluted in casualness, hurt differently. Sarah kept working. By the second week, she realized she wouldn't be able to move certain pieces alone. There was a huge concrete slab covering part of the foundations that wouldn't budge, not even with the iron pry bar she had bought. It was too heavy, and she knew that under that slab there were cut stones, because she had already found part of the pattern at the edges. She needed help, and help cost money. She had saved a small reserve, the result of months of economizing, which she used for emergencies. She used part of it to hire 3 men by the day, Jake, Bill, and a young man everyone called Cody, the the son of a local farmer, barely 20 but strong as an ox. The three of them arrived on the agreed morning without asking many questions, because work was work. It took them 3 hours to move the slab. They used pry bars, chains, and the jack from a borrowed truck. When the concrete gave way and slid to the side, raising a cloud of dust, Sarah stood still. What was underneath weren't just cut stones, there were tiles, not fragments, whole pieces, leaning against each other, as if someone had placed them there on purpose. Square, thin, with a geometric pattern in shades of blue, green, and white that time had left intact because the concrete had protected them like a vault. The color had that soft richness of handmade things, without the cold uniformity of industrial pieces. Each one was slightly different from the others, with variations in tone that came from the fire and the potter's hand. Jake bent down and picked one up. "That's a pretty thing," he said, turning the piece in his hand. "Looks old." "It is," Sarah said. "Is it worth anything?" "I don't know," she replied. And that was a lie. She did know. Not an exact number, but with the certainty of someone who had seen something similar on a restoration job she worked on years ago, in a town 2 days' journey away. Handcrafted tiles from extinct potteries. The chief engineer on that job had talked to her for an entire afternoon about that subject, at a time when everyone had gone to lunch and only the two of them stayed, him explaining and her listening, with that attention she had for anything concerning old materials. She had kept his name in her phone, Edward Collins. When the men left with their day's wages, Sarah was alone on the lot. She covered the boxes she had set aside with a blue tarp, tied it well, and took pictures of each piece with her phone. She took a picture of the pattern, the back, the mark stamped into the clay that she could barely read but was clearly a pottery mark. She sat on a concrete block, watching those photos on her phone for a long time, with the sun setting behind the cornfield. The sky turned orange, then purple, then dark. She didn't move. She was trying to understand the magnitude of what she had found, and trying to understand the magnitude of what she could lose if she didn't act carefully. That night, lying in bed with her phone in her hand, she sent the photos to Edward Collins with a short message. "Edward, do you remember me? Sarah, I worked with you on the renovation of the house on Maple Street. I found some tiles out in the countryside. I needed your opinion." She fell asleep without a reply. But she woke up at 6 in the morning with her phone buzzing. Edward's message was longer than she expected. He said he recognized the pattern. He asked about the origin, the name of the tile works, if she had been able to read it. He said he had a contact who could confirm it better, but that, from the photo, those tiles were from a tile works that had operated in the countryside of the state for only 12 years, between the 50s and 60s, before closing. That architects who worked with historic building restoration had been looking for those tiles for years. That each one was worth, at minimum, the equivalent of a month of her salary. And there were hundreds there. Sarah had to sit on the edge of the bed. She stayed that way for a long time, with her phone in her hands, staring at the floor. The sun hadn't yet come in through the window. The birds outside were starting to sing, and she thought of her father, Mr. Arthur Harrison, a master mason, who had taken her to job sites since she was 8 years old and taught her the difference between a cord and a solid brick, holding her hand as they walked through the debris. Sarah, debris to someone who doesn't know how to see, to someone who knows its material, Dunhee would say. She thought of her father that morning and felt a mixture of longing and gratitude that she couldn't quite name, but she also felt something else, a thread of fear, because that was too big to keep quiet about for long. She decided not to tell anyone, at least for now. She kept working on the lot as if nothing had changed, separating bricks, sorting wood, removing metal. The boxes with the tiles remained covered by the tarp in the corner of the shed. She herself didn't open them without need, but the calm lasted less than she expected. In the 3rd week, George Sterling started noticing the trucks. It wasn't exactly a secret that Sarah was removing material. The agreement allowed for that, but George never imagined she would manage to get so many truckloads out of a lot he thought was just rubble. He saw it from the window of the general store, which was across the road, and did the math in his head with that expression of someone who's starting to think they miscalculated. He watched for a few days, first with curiosity, then with that calm suspicion of someone who has a lot to lose and a lot of control over the things around him. He wasn't a man who acted on impulse. He was the type who observes, waits, and acts when he's sure. That's when he called his nephew. Tyler Sterling was 26 years old, the son of George's sister, and had been living at his uncle's house since he split up with a girlfriend he should never have been with in the first place. He did odd jobs at the general store, drove a truck when needed, and had that nervous kind of cleverness of someone who wants to grow up too fast and hasn't yet understood that cleverness without patience is just noise. George sent Tyler to discreetly pass by the lot to see what was being removed. Tyler went. He stopped the car on the road, pretended to have some engine trouble, got out and stood looking. He saw the bricks stacked, the wooden beams separated, and in the back of the shed, the boxes covered by a blue tarp. That caught his attention. Bricks and wood were common materials. Anyone knows what bricks and wood are, but carefully covered boxes were something else. He waited for Sarah to turn her back to get water from the bottle in her car. He entered the lot, walked slowly to the shed. He lowered his hand toward the tarp. "Can I help you with something?" Sarah's voice came from behind him. Tyler straightened up. He turned around with a smile that tried to look carefree. "Oh, I was just looking. Uncle George sent me to check on how the work's going here." "The work's fine," she said. "And the lot is mine now. I have the signed contract." Of course, I know." He waved his hand, as if it didn't matter. "Just a visit." He left without hurry, but glancing at the boxes one last time before turning the corner. Sarah stood in the middle of the lot watching the car disappear into the dust on the road. She felt that familiar tightness, the same one she felt when things were about to shift, and she still didn't know which way. That same night she called Edward. "Edward, I need to close a deal fast. Someone's sniffing around what I've got here. How many whole pieces do you have?" "I counted 243 yesterday." Silence on the other end. "Sarah," he said slowly, "do you know what you have there?" "I have an idea. I have a contact, an architect who restores historic buildings. His name is Nathan Brooks. I'll give him your number. But listen, you need to store this stuff safely. Don't let anyone onto that lot without you by their side." "Got it," she said. 2 days later, Nathan Brooks called. He spoke little, asked a lot. He asked about the pattern, the thickness, the back of the pieces. He asked if she had managed to read the pottery mark. She had tried, but the stamp was worn off on many pieces. On a few, she could make out 2 letters, H and S. "Heritage Stone and Tile," he said without hesitation. That name clearly meant something to him. He told her that Heritage Stone and Tile had been in business for 11 years, that they made custom pieces for specific projects, that they had closed for reasons he didn't know for sure, and that their inventory had been scattered across projects in various towns in the region. But no one had ever found an intact batch that size. "Can you send me a sample?" 4 pieces, well packed. "I can." "And in the meantime, don't sell to anyone. Give me a week." She agreed. She set aside 4 pieces, wrapped them in newspaper, put them in a reinforced cardboard box, and sent them by mail to the address Nathan sent in a message. The week of waiting was the longest she had lived through in a long time. She kept working on the lot during the day, moving what she could move alone, organizing what was already separated. But her mind wasn't fully on the work. There was a part of her that was on alert all the time, waiting for Tyler's next move, waiting for Nathan's call, waiting for something she couldn't name, but felt was coming. And it was during that week that George went to a lawyer's office. Sarah didn't know yet. She found out from Mrs. Hazel. Hazel Jenkins was 68, had lived alone for nearly 2 decades, ever since her husband left for a bigger town and never came back. She had a little red tile-roofed house 300 yards from the lot and a habit of walking early in the morning along the road, which gave her an up-to-date map of everything happening in the district. It wasn't gossip. It was attention. There was a difference. Mrs. Hazel had known Sarah since she was a girl. She had known her father too, old Mr. Arthur, and held for her a silent respect that had never needed to be spoken aloud to be real. She stopped at the edge of the lot on a Wednesday morning while Sarah was stacking wood. "Sarah, can I tell you something?" "Go ahead, Mrs. Hazel." She crossed her arms with that look of someone who knows more than she's letting on. "Yesterday, I saw attorney Mr. Henderson's car in front of Sterling's General Store, over an hour. And George came out afterward with a folder. You know attorney Mr. Henderson is a lawyer, right?" Sarah stopped stacking. She stood looking at the wood for a moment. "I know, Mrs. Hazel. I'm not sticking my nose where I wasn't called. But when I saw that, I thought of you. I figured I should warn you." Sarah turned to the woman and looked at her with the quiet gratitude of someone who rarely receives that kind of attention. "Thank you. Really." Hazel nodded, turned around and kept walking as if nothing had happened. But that information weighed on Sarah's shoulders for the rest of the day. It wasn't a surprise, not exactly. She knew that when Tyler came back with the report to George, something would start moving. But knowing the lawyer was already in the game changed the timeline. She needed to act sooner. George's call wasn't a surprise when it came. It came the following afternoon. His voice was different, less relaxed. He said he was going over some things, that he thought there were details in the contract that needed to be reviewed, that there were valuable items he hadn't been informed about at the time of the sale. "The contract was signed, George," she said. "Contracts can be revisited, Sarah. My lawyer said that depending on what was taken from there may be grounds for a challenge." She took a deep breath. "If you have any issues, you can have your lawyer talk to mine." "You have a lawyer?" "I will," she said, and she hung up. She didn't. Not yet. But she would get one. She stood there with the phone in her hand for a moment, looking at the field next to the property. The corn was growing, deep green, dense, oblivious to everything happening on this side of the fence. She thought about how she had always loved that quiet indifference of nature. Things grow because that's what they're meant to do. They don't ask permission, they don't explain themselves to anyone. She went to get a lawyer referral that very afternoon. Nathan Brooks's response came before the lawyer did. He called on a Saturday morning, when she was on the property, and his voice had an excitement she hadn't heard before. "Sarah, these are pieces from Heritage Stone and Tile. I'm certain now. I sent them to a specialist colleague and he confirmed it. The pattern is from the Southern Fields series, which they produced between 1958 and 1961. These are the rarest. You can't find this stuff in decades." She stayed quiet, letting the information sink in. "How much is the whole lot worth?" she asked. He gave her a number. Sarah had to lean against the nearest brick. It was nearly 6 times what she had saved over the last 10 years. "But I need to be honest with you," Nathan continued. "This is going to draw attention. When I post the photos for buyers, people from all over will be interested, and you'll need to be legally prepared to sell this material safely." "I'm already arranging that," she said. It wasn't entirely true yet, but it would be. That same weekend, she looked up Edward and asked for a lawyer referral. He recommended a woman named attorney Martha Fletcher, who worked with civil contracts in another town, about 25 miles away. Sarah took the car on Monday morning and went without telling anyone. Martha Fletcher was a woman in her mid-50s with neatly cut black hair who received people in her office with an objectivity that Sarah found reassuring. She didn't ask more than necessary. She analyzed the contract in silence, running her finger down the page with the focus of someone who had read a lot and knew where to look first. "General Use Clause, subsection 2, she said. "Right here. Any and all material present on the property, including structures, coverings, foundations, and other construction components. Signed by the original owner." "He signed that?" Sarah asked. "He did, and this clause covers what you found. Your legal position is solid. But he has more money to drag out a long fight." Martha looked at her over her glasses. "Then we don't let it become a long fight. Let's build our case now, before he files any appeal. Can you cover the initial retainer?" Sarah had set aside the hardwood to sell. It was enough. She agreed. She left the office with that mix of relief and tension that comes with making a big decision, but knowing the road ahead is still long. The afternoon was cold when she got back to her car. She sat for a moment before starting it, staring at the windshield. The street in front of her was smooth asphalt, no potholes, unlike the dirt road in Dusty Creek, and she thought about how many times in her life she had left a smooth road and returned to the uneven ground, and how it was always the uneven ground that felt more real. When she got back to the district, Margaret was waiting at her front door. Sarah saw her from a distance and felt her stomach tighten. Her sister had her car parked outside, arms crossed, with the expression of someone who had been waiting longer than she thought was fair. "Can I come in?" Margaret asked, without a greeting. "Sure." They sat at the kitchen table. Sarah put water on to boil without asking if her sister wanted coffee. It was an automatic gesture, the kind the body makes when the mind is too busy. "David heard some talk," Margaret began. "That you found something on George's land?" "David hears a lot of things. It's a small town, Sarah." "Yes." Silence. The water started to boil. Sarah got up, put the coffee grounds in the filter, stood with her back turned for a moment. "I want to know what you found," Margaret said, in a voice that tried to be direct but came out as an accusation. "I found construction materials. That's what I bought." "David said he heard about old tiles." Sarah turned around with 2 mugs in her hand and placed them on the table with a calm she didn't know where it came from. "Who told David that?" "It doesn't matter who told him. It matters a lot." Margaret looked away, ran her hand over the tablecloth. It was a cloth with embroidered flowers that had belonged to their mother. Sarah had kept it for years without really knowing why. "Sarah, we're sisters." "Yes." "And when you needed to take that technical course years ago, who paid for half of it?" Sarah was quiet. "I helped you when you needed it," Margaret continued, "and now you found something big and didn't even tell me." "I didn't tell you because you went to Miller's grocery and said in front of everyone that I never got anywhere," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "Didn't you?" Her sister opened her mouth, closed it. "Margaret, I love you, but there's no technical course debt that gives you a right to a piece of what I worked to achieve on my own. You leave with this coffee, and this conversation never happened." Margaret was silent for a few seconds, with that expression of someone not used to being shut down. She stood up, grabbed her purse. There was a stiffness in her shoulders that Sarah recognized from childhood, when her older sister didn't get what she wanted and pretended she hadn't wanted it. "You'll regret treating me like this." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but not today." Her sister left without drinking the coffee. She closed the door with a firmness that wasn't quite a slam. Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, with the 2 mugs on the table, and a pain in her chest she didn't quite know how to name. It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who spends her entire life being underestimated by the people who should believe in her more than anyone. She drank both coffees. Then she went to sleep. But she didn't sleep well. She lay awake thinking about her sister, the lawsuit ahead, the boxes covered in the shed, wondering if she had done the right thing by sending Margaret away, or if there was a version of that situation where things could have been different. And with no clear answer, she stared at the ceiling until the room began to turn grey with the dawn. In the days that followed, she kept working on the lot during the day, but at night she'd hold her phone, following the developments as Edward and Nathan told her about them. Nathan had posted the photos of the tiles in a closed architecture and restoration group, without mentioning the owner's name or the exact location. In less than 48 hours, 2 different buyers had already asked for the price. One of them was a woman named Lydia Thompson. Lydia was 57, a researcher of historical heritage and building materials, and worked at a university in a big city, several hours away. When she saw the photos of the tiles, she sent a long message to Nathan in the middle of the night, full of exclamation points and a string of questions. She was the type who sleeps little and thinks a lot. She recognized the pattern. Not only that, she had written an article about heritage stone and tile 5 years earlier, at a time when she was still looking for documentary records about the pottery, without ever finding any physical pieces from the collection. She thought they were all lost. The article ended up being about absence, about what disappears when small manufacturers close, and no one documents them. Nathan passed Lydia's contact to Sarah. The two talked by phone on a cloudy afternoon, while Sarah walked slowly among the rows of brick she had organized herself. "I need to see those pieces in person," Lydia said. "Can I come over next week?" "You can. And there's more I'd like to check. Do you know if there's any historical record from that factory? Documentation, blueprints, anything?" "I don't know, but I know who might." The name Sarah had in mind was Mrs. Dorothy, the former secretary at the district registry office. She had retired almost 10 years ago, but was known for keeping copies of everything at home because she didn't trust the digital archive. She always said paper lasts longer than computers, and in that district, no one argued with her about that, because she was 81 and had been right about a lot of things. Sarah went to Mrs. Dorothy's house the next morning. The old lady received visitors with natural suspicion. She opened the screen door before opening the main door, looked at Sarah for a few seconds, as if deciding whether to let her in. Then she opened it. "Sarah, Agenor's daughter, right?" "That's right, Mrs. Dorothy. Your father was a good man. He built the porch on my backyard. Come in." The house smelled of stale bread and medicine. It was tidy, with that order of places inhabited by people who live alone and compensate for absence with the organization of things. There were saints everywhere, some artificial flowers in vases, and a pendulum clock that no longer ticked, but still showed the time. Sarah explained what she was looking for. Mrs. Dorothy listened without interrupting, with that attentiveness of someone who was a registry secretary for over 30 years and learned that what isn't said aloud is often the most important part. "Archive of the old factory construction," she repeated. "That's at least 50 years old." "It is. I'll check." She went to the room she used as storage. She stayed in there for nearly half an hour. Sarah waited in the living room, looking at the photos on the wall. A black and white photo of a couple on a porch she recognized. It must have been the porch her father had built. Mrs. Dorothy came back with a dusty cardboard box, placed it on the table, and opened it with that calm of someone who knows that the right things deserve to be opened slowly. "Here's everything from the old registry that they were going to throw away when they modernized the system. I didn't let them," she said proudly. "If you want to look, go ahead, but don't take anything out of here." Sarah spent nearly 3 hours there, carefully flipping through yellow documents. She found land blueprints, minutes of town council meetings, purchase and sale contracts from decades past. There was a whole history of the district in those pages that no one else read anymore. And then she found a construction report from 1967, describing the expansion of the grain processing plant, George's plant. She read it slowly. The document detailed the stages of the work, the materials used, the contractors hired. And in a footnote, in tiny print that she had to lean in to read, it said, "Tiles for internal cladding supplied by Heritage Stone and Tile under direct order from Mr. Thomas Sterling." Thomas Sterling, George's father. Sarah stared at that line for a long time. The irony was almost cruel. The man trying to void her contract, claiming he didn't know the value of those tiles, had a father who ordered those tiles, who came from the same family, who carried the same last name. It means George grew up in that plant. He probably walked through those rooms as a child. He probably ran his hand over those tiled walls without ever knowing what he had in his hands. And when times changed and the plant was demolished, he couldn't see what was buried there. The father saw it. The son didn't. She excused herself to Mrs. Dorothy, went to the bathroom and stared at her own reflection in the mirror for a moment. She took a deep breath. She went back to the living room. "Mrs. Dorothy, can I take a picture of this document?" "You can, but you can't take it." She photographed every page with her phone. She sent everything to attorney Martha Fletcher that same afternoon, while she was still in the car in front of the house. The lawyer called back in half an hour. "Sarah, where did you find this?" "In the personal archive of a former clerk at the registry office. This document is crucial. It proves that the tiles were specifically ordered for that project by the original owner. which makes them an integral part of the land and everything on it. Your legal position is even stronger now. If George's lawyer files the lawsuit, we'll use this. And if he doesn't file, even better, but get ready, because I think he will. The notice arrived 4 days later. A cold morning, overcast sky, that kind of low fog the countryside often has in winter. Sarah was at the lot organizing the last rows of brick when she saw the man pull up in his car, check the paper, check the lot's address, and walk over to her. She signed the notice without saying a word. She read the paper right there, standing between the rows of brick, with the wind rustling the blue tarp covering the crates, and she had the strange feeling that she had been expecting it. But knowing something is going to happen doesn't make it easier when it actually does. She stood staring at the paper for a long time after the man left. The legal language was cold, full of terms she didn't know, but the meaning was clear. George Sterling claimed there were items of historical and commercial value on the lot that had not been properly disclosed at the time of the transaction, and that the contract should be revised or voided. She put the paper in her apron pocket and kept working, but that night she didn't sleep well. She stayed awake thinking about how many months the lawsuit could drag on, about the money George had to sustain a long fight, about the possibility of losing everything before she could even achieve what she had dreamed of. Your mind goes to bad places when you spend too long in the dark, without sleep. She thought about Margaret storming off angry. She thought about Edward, still unsure if he would hold up under the pressure. She thought about the crates covered in the shed, with the heritage stone and tile pieces that still had no definite owner. She thought about everything that could go wrong at once, and felt that familiar weight in her chest, the one she had known since her father left, and she was left alone trying to understand how the world works without him. The next morning, she called Edward. "I need you not to walk away from it," she said, without beating around the bush. "Walk away from what?" "The deal. The partnership with Nathan. I know George might try to offer you something to pull back." Silence on the other end, a silence that lasted a second longer than it should have. "Who told you that?" "Mrs. Hazel," she said. "She saw you leaving George's general store last week." Another silence, longer this time. "He called me there," Edward said finally. "Made a pitch for a new project. Big. Said it would be best if I stayed neutral toward you." And I left without signing anything. But I thought about it for a few days. He admitted with an honesty she hadn't expected. "I've got bills to pay, Sarah. It's not simple." "I know." "But I called you, didn't I?" His voice grew firmer. "I'm on your side. But I figured I needed to be honest about what happened." Sarah stayed silent for a moment, feeling the weight of that imperfect loyalty that had chosen honesty over convenience. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "That means more than any contract." She hung up and stared at her phone for a moment. There was something complicated about it. Edward had hesitated. He'd thought about giving in, but he'd chosen to call and tell her, and she knew from experience that it's much easier to do the wrong thing in silence than to do the right thing and admit you considered otherwise. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit that like button and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us folks who are just starting out. Now, moving on. Lydia Thompson arrived in the district on a Thursday morning in a small car full of folders. She was a petite woman with short grey hair, round glasses, and the energy of someone who's always in a hurry on her own terms. She got out of the car and looked around with that researcher's habit of seeing context before details. She reached the lot, greeted Sarah with a firm handshake and went straight to the boxes. Sarah removed the tarp. Lydia bent down, picked up a piece, turned it over and over. Then she picked up another, then another. She stayed silent for a long while, hands on her knees, looking at the set as a whole. There was a quality of focus about her that Sarah respected in silence. She didn't interrupt. "Do you know what you've got here?" she asked finally. "I have an idea. This is the only intact batch of the Southern Fields line from Heritage Stone and Tile that exists in the world," Lydia said, in that voice of someone stating something enormous very calmly. "I searched for this material for 5 years. I interviewed 4 former employees of the tile works. 2 have already passed on. The other 2 didn't know where the pieces had ended up. Sarah took a deep breath. And then I send an email to Nathan and he sends a photo, Lydia continued, standing up with that lightness of someone whose feet are on the ground but whose eyes are far away. You know this has to be documented? I know. I want to buy half the lot for the research collection. And what I can't buy, I'll make sure goes to someone who'll preserve it. Not for some fancy restaurant decoration. Despite everything, Sarah let out a small laugh. You're tough, Lydia said with a smile. Learned it from my father. Lydia spent the whole afternoon on the lot. She photographed every piece, jotted notes in notebooks measured with a ruler. She was meticulous without being slow, efficient without being cold. Sarah liked her the way you like people who know what they're doing. Before leaving, Lydia said she was going to the local courthouse to check historical records of the factory. Sarah didn't say she already knew what she'd find. She waited. The next day, Lydia's phone rang at 9 in the morning, her voice different, more serious. Sarah, I need to tell you what I found at the courthouse. Go ahead. There's a document from 1967, an account of the factory's construction, with the name of the person who ordered the tiles. Thomas Sterling, Sarah said. Pause. You already knew? Yes. And do you know what that means for the open case? My lawyer explained it. Another pause. Sarah, Lydia said, in that tone of someone reorganizing the admiration they have for another person. You didn't find that land by chance, did you? Not by chance, she said, but I also didn't know what I would actually find. But you prepared everything. I prepared what I could. Lydia was quiet for a moment. I want to help you with the case, not as a buyer, as a researcher. I'll submit a formal declaration about the historical value of these pieces and their documented origin. That can be used in your defense. Sarah closed her eyes for a second. That changes a lot, she said. I know. That's why I'm offering. Lydia's declaration arrived in writing 2 days later. Attorney Martha read it carefully and said that together with the notary document, their position was so solid that George's lawyer would probably ask for a meeting before getting anywhere near a judge. She was right. But before the meeting there was a twist Sarah didn't expect. Tyler showed up at the land again. This time he didn't pretend to have engine trouble. He came walking, hands in his pockets, with that posture of someone making an effort to look casual. Sarah was sorting stones when she saw him arrive. She stood up, took off the rubber glove from her right hand, and waited. Hey, Sarah, he said. Tyler. Can I say something? Go ahead. He stood silent for a few seconds, looking at the stones. Then he looked at her. I was the one who told my uncle there was something hidden here. I know. But I saw what you're building, and I saw how you work. He paused. I think my uncle was wrong to try to take this from you. Sarah stayed quiet, waiting. I'm not here to ask for anything, just wanted to say that. He shrugged. I know it doesn't change much. It changes something, she said honestly. Why are you telling me this? He thought for a moment. My dad was like that too, he said finally. He worked like crazy, and my mom never appreciated it. She thought he was always falling behind. He paused longer. After he left, she understood. But by then it was too late. Sarah looked at him. For a moment, George's nephew was just a 26-year-old guy carrying a weight he didn't know where to put down. Thank you, she said. He nodded and left. Sarah watched his back for a moment, then went back to work. But that stayed with her for a long time. The summons for the meeting between the parties came a week later, in a neutral office in the nearest town, on a day of light rain that couldn't decide whether to stop or keep going. Sarah went with Attorney Martha, in a dark suit and leather briefcase. George arrived with his lawyer, Attorney Mr. Henderson, and his nephew Tyler, who hadn't been invited but showed up anyway. When both sides sat at the table, Sarah looked directly at George. For the first time since everything started, he didn't have that easy smile of someone who finds things amusing. He was quiet. He had the expression of someone who went to a lawyer expecting a simple fight and found out the fight was complicated. Attorney Martha calmly presented the documents, the original contract with the general use clause, the 1967 report with Thomas Sterling's name, Lydia's declaration, the technical confirmation of the pieces. George's lawyer asked for a break. The two left the room. While they waited, Tyler, who had been leaning against the wall outside the table, looked at Sarah with that expression of someone who no longer knows which side they're on. "All this over some old tiles," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone. Sarah didn't answer. Attorney Martha glanced sideways at her and gave a discreet smile. When George and the attorney returned, the atmosphere in the room had already changed, quieter. George's lawyer said that after reviewing the documents presented, his client had decided not to proceed with the case. George didn't say anything. He kept his eyes fixed on the table. He signed the closing document that Attorney Martha had prepared in advance, because she too had expected this. And he left the room without looking at Sarah. Tyler followed behind, and at the door he turned around. "You're lucky," he said. "No, I'm not," Sarah said without anger, without arrogance. "I'm prepared." The young man left. Attorney Martha waited for the door to close, looked at Sarah, and said, "There." And that simple word carried the weight of weeks of tension, of sleepless nights, of a sister who had left in anger, of a man who had laughed at her proposal, and of a pile of rubble that the whole world saw as trash. Sarah nodded. She didn't cry. It wasn't the moment for wet eyes. That would come later. On her way out of the office, under the light rain that was still falling, she stood still for a moment on the sidewalk. Attorney Martha opened her umbrella and asked if she wanted a ride. Sarah said no, that she was going to stay a while. The lawyer left. Sarah stayed in the rain. And there, alone on that wet sidewalk in a town that wasn't hers, she let her breath go. One at a time. Her chest slowly opened up, and her eyes, those did get wet. Not from sadness, from relief. From that deep relief that only comes when someone who has fought for something for a long time can finally let go. She stayed there for a few minutes. Then she walked to her car and left. On the way back to Dusty Creek, she stopped at the gas station at the entrance of the nearby town. She ordered a coffee in a styrofoam cup and leaned against the car, drinking it while the sun tried to peek through the clouds. The rain had lessened to a light drizzle. An old man sitting on a bench in front of the station looked at her and said, "You all right, miss?" "I am," she said. "Today was a good day." He nodded, as if that made sense, and went back to looking at the road. Sarah took another sip of coffee and thought that sometimes happiness isn't a big thing. It's a light drizzle after rain, and a styrofoam coffee, and the awareness that you did the right thing and succeeded. The negotiation with Lydia Thompson took another 2 weeks. They talked on the phone several times, sat together for an entire afternoon at Sarah's kitchen table with coffee and notebooks. Lydia was the type of person who doesn't close a deal in a hurry, who goes back and forth, who questions and confirms. Sarah liked that. It meant she took it seriously. In the end, Lydia kept 120 pieces for documentation and research collection, at an amount Sarah never imagined she'd see all at once. The other 123 pieces went to Nathan Brooks, who already had a buyer lined up, a historical property restorer from another city who intended to use the tiles in 3 restoration projects with recognized cultural value. Nathan guaranteed that the pieces would go to places where they would be seen and preserved. Sarah believed him because he had no reason to lie. The money arrived in 2 separate transfers, days apart. Each one made Sarah stop what she was doing and stare at her phone screen for a while. Those numbers meant more than money. They meant the confirmation of something she had kept inside herself for many years, that she knew what she saw, that the eye trained by her father had value, that what others discard isn't always trash. She didn't spend anything right away. She left the money untouched for a week, like someone lets something new settle before messing with it. And that week, she went looking for reinforcement for what was ahead. Jake and Bill went to the lot to ask if there was more work. She said there was, and she asked if they knew anyone else who needed a job. Jake said his neighbor's daughter, Abigail, had recently lost her job at a bakery that had closed its doors, and that Mrs. Gladys, who lived at the end of the road, knew how to sort building materials better than most, because her husband had been a mason before falling ill. Sarah went to see Mrs. Gladys that afternoon. The lady was 63 years old, with sun-weathered skin, hands that looked like leather, just like Sarah's apron. She was wary when Sarah knocked on the door, peering through a crack before opening it. "What do you need?" "To talk about work, Mrs. Gladys." The lady looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the door. The house was small and clean. There was a photo of her husband on the sideboard, a man with a wide smile whom Sarah hadn't known well. Mrs. Gladys's husband had fallen ill 3 years earlier and had been bedridden for nearly 2 years. The neighbours helped when they could, but Mrs. Gladys had carried most of the burden alone, because that's how it works. "I have a job sorting materials," Sarah explained. "Brick, stone, wood. I need people who know how to look at the material and understand what's worth keeping and what isn't. Jake said Mr. Raymond taught you a lot." Mrs. Gladys was quiet for a moment. "He did. But it's been a while since I've used it." "Something you truly learn doesn't just disappear," Sarah said. The lady looked at her own hands. "How much does it pay?" Sarah told her the amount. It was fair. More than fair. Mrs. Gladys said yes. Abigail was hired too, a woman about 30 years old who had learned to be practical from an early age, a farmer's daughter, who didn't complain about hard work and learned quickly. When Sarah explained what she needed, Abigail asked 3 times to make sure she understood, took notes in a small notebook and left saying she'd show up on Monday morning. And she did, at the agreed time, without delay. With the team formed, the work on the lot picked up pace. What used to take Sarah days to do alone was now finished in hours, and she taught while she worked, the way her father had taught her, by showing, not explaining. "This brick here, Abigail, tap it and listen." The young woman tapped. "Hear that? Solid. This one," she picked up another, tapped it. "Hear the difference?" Abigail listened and learned. She was one of those people who learn through their bodies before learning through their minds, and Sarah recognized that way because it was her own. Mrs. Gladys was different. She already knew. She just needed a place to use what she knew. When she arrived at the lot on Monday morning, she spent about 15 minutes walking among the rows of materials Sarah had organized, touching here and there, evaluating. Then she turned to Sarah and said, "These cornerstones here, you sorted them by size, but you should also sort them by face. Smooth-faced stone is worth more." Sarah stopped. She looked at the stone. She looked at Mrs. Gladys. "You're right." Mrs. Gladys gave that quiet smile of someone who had hoped to hear that, but wasn't entirely sure. "Can you reorganize them?" Sarah asked. "I can." And she did, alone, with a patience that Sarah recognized as the patience of people who had spent a long time waiting to be heard. The following weeks were filled with steady work and a dynamic that naturally formed among the 4 of them. Jake and Bill carried and moved things. Abigail sorted and recorded. Mrs. Gladys evaluated and organized, and Sarah made the decisions, taught what was needed, and handled whatever came up unexpectedly. One afternoon, while they were working, Mrs. Gladys stopped near Sarah as the two looked at the wall that had gone up that day. "Did you learn all this on your own?" she asked. "With my father," Sarah said. "He must have been a good man." "It was," she said slowly, "and it taught me to see what others don't see." Mrs. Gladys was quiet for a moment, then said, "My husband taught me to cook in a way that everyone eats and stays quiet. Nobody values that while he was still well." She paused. "I think what others don't value is exactly what has the most value." Sarah looked at her. "Yeah," she said. "You just summed up my whole life in one sentence." They both laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that only happens between people who have been through tough enough times to know that humor isn't frivolity, it's survival. The strip of land next to the lot was the next negotiation. Small, from a neighbor who had never done anything with it and was open to selling. The man's name was Old Silas, an older gentleman in a straw hat who grew a patch of pumpkins outside the fence and who, when Sarah went to talk to him, was watering the plants with a small hose and an air of someone at peace with what he has. "Interested in selling that strip over there?" she asked, without beating around the bush. Old Silas looked at the land, looked at her, looked back at the land. What are you going to do? Build. Build what? A shed, he thought for a moment. What kind of shed? For building materials. Old Silas adjusted his hat. Going to make noise? There will be trucks, but not at night. He considered this with the seriousness of someone who weighs everything in its proper balance. Pay me fair, and I'll sell. She paid fair. The construction of the shed began on a morning with strong sun. With that open sky the countryside has when it wants to show it knows how to be beautiful. Sarah arrived early, before everyone else, marked the ground with lime, looked at the length of the lot, and thought about the size of what she was about to raise. It wasn't big. It was enough. The walls were built with the solid bricks she had picked out herself. Each row laid with mortar she mixed herself, in the same mix her father used. Jake and Bill carried and laid. Mrs. Gladys mixed. Abigail measured. And Sarah kept an eye on everything, correcting what needed it, teaching what she could. There were weeks of sun, dust, back pain, and a satisfaction she couldn't quite describe. She woke before dawn and slept before 10. Her body complained, but the rest was at peace. One night, sitting on the porch after work with a mug of tea in her hand, she looked at the lot in the dark. She couldn't see anything, just the silhouette of the walls that had gone up that day, but she knew what was there. She knew every brick, every row, every stone of the entrance floor that still had to be laid. She thought about how it all started. A sleepless night, a signed paper, a man who laughed. That laugh didn't hurt anymore. It had turned into something else. Into fuel, maybe. The kind of thing you use to keep going when tiredness says stop. The roof was the hardest part. The hardwood beams, which Sarah had carefully saved from the beginning, were sawed, treated and fitted with the help of a trusted carpenter Jake recommended. A quiet man, precise in his work, who didn't talk much but delivered everything right. He arrived in the morning, greeted with a nod, worked all day without a phone and left when he was done. When the roof was finished, Sarah stood outside looking at it for a while. That wood had been buried under concrete for decades, and now it was on top, protecting what was being built. There was a logic to that she found beautiful. The entrance floor was the final chapter of the construction. The cut stone from the old foundations, which she had decided not to sell from the start, were carefully removed and placed in even rows at the entrance of the shed. They looked perfect. Ashes, irregular, with that texture of having weathered a long time, but fitted one into the other in a way that looked intentional. On the morning the shed was finished, before calling anyone, Sarah went in alone. She stood in the middle looking at the solid brick walls, the dark wood roof, the stone floor at the entrance. Everything that had come from the pile that George thought was junk. Everything she had sorted, saved, carried, protected and built. The smell was of wood and fresh mortar, the same smell as her father's job sites. She wouldn't be able to explain to anyone what she felt there. It was something too big to fit into words. It was the kind of moment that happens once, that doesn't repeat itself, that you carry for the rest of your life as a reference point. She stayed like that for a long while in silence. Then she left and called Edward. He showed up in the afternoon with Nathan Brooks, who was passing through the region. The two arrived together, got out of the car, stood at the entrance looking at the shed. Neither said anything for a moment. "You used the material from the land itself," Nathan finally said. "All of it." "That's a statement," Edward said. "It's a building," she corrected lightly. Nathan walked over to the wall, ran his hand over the bricks. He stopped at a brick that had a mark engraved deep on its surface, the stamp of the old brickyard. The same mark that was on the pieces from Heritage Stone and Tile. He looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't fully name. "This brick has history," he said. "It does," she agreed. "And now it has a future too," he finished. Edward stood at the door, looking from outside in, with that expression of someone trying to understand something bigger than what they're seeing. "When you bought that land," he said, "did you already know you were going to build this?" She thought for a moment. "I didn't know everything, but I knew I was going to build something." He nodded, as if that answer was more honest than a complete answer would have been. Before leaving, Nathan said that one of the museums that would receive the pieces from Heritage Stone and Tile intended to make a small origin plaque describing the lot, the history of the brickyard, and the circumstance of the find, and he asked if Sarah wanted her name to appear on it. She thought for a second. "Put my father's name," she said. Nathan looked at her. "Arthur Harrison, bricklayer," she said. The eye was mine, but the teaching was his. He nodded. The plaque was the last detail of the shed. Sarah had ordered it from a lumber yard, a hardwood board, sanded, with the letters burned into it. The name she chose was simple, Harrison Supply Co., her father's surname. There was no subtitle, no ornament, just that. She screwed the plaque onto the entrance of the shed alone, at the end of an afternoon, with the sun setting behind the cornfields and dyeing the sky that orange color that the countryside keeps like a family secret. She stood looking at the plaque for a long moment. She ran her hand over the wood, felt the relief of the letters under her fingertips. And she thought of her father, of all the mornings she woke up before the sun with him, of all the job sites, of all the lessons learned smelling dust and mortar, of how he would pick up a brick and say, "This here has history, daughter. Never throw it away without looking at it right." She had never thrown it away without looking at it right. 3 days after opening the shed, Margaret showed up. She didn't call first. She arrived by car on a Saturday morning with a jar of spiced pumpkin preserves in her hands. The same one their mother used to make when they were little, with cloves and cinnamon, that simmered on low heat for hours until it reached that dark gold color. Sarah was organizing a shelf inside the shed when she heard the car. She went out to see. She stood at the door when she saw her sister approaching with the jar. Margaret stopped a few steps away. She looked at the shed, looked at the sign, looked at Sarah, and for the first time in a long time, the older sister didn't carry that posture of hierarchy. She stood still like someone who had arrived at a place they didn't know and was trying to figure out the rules. "It looks good," she said, in a tone that wasn't an easy compliment. It was the admission of someone who had seen it and couldn't deny it. "It does," Sarah said. Margaret held out the jar. Sarah looked at it, looked at her sister, accepted it. She didn't invite her in. It wasn't time yet. But she held the jar with both hands and stood there at the entrance of the shed built from rubble nobody wanted, with her sister standing outside, the one who had said she'd never get anywhere. "I said something I shouldn't have," Margaret said, her voice carrying the weight of confessing something that cost a lot to say. "You did," Sarah agreed. "I won't ask for any part of what's yours. I never should have thought of that." "You shouldn't have." More silence. A bird sang somewhere in the field next door. Old Silas on his land was gathering pumpkins into a basket. The world went on as it always does, indifferent and beautiful. "But you're my sister," Margaret said with a vulnerability Sarah hadn't heard in a long time. "And I don't want to lose my sister over money that wasn't even mine to begin with." Sarah kept looking at her. All that stubbornness of years, all that unasked for hierarchy, every time Margaret had belittled what she did to feel bigger. It was all there, in that jar of spiced pumpkin preserves and in that costly sentence. "You won't lose her," Sarah said, "but you'll need patience, 'cause I'm still processing it." "I know. And it's not just about the money. It's about what you said back at the market. I know that too." They stood in silence for a moment, that kind of silence between sisters that carries everything left unsaid, but doesn't need to be said right now. "Want some coffee?" Sarah asked finally. Margaret almost smiled. "Yes." They went inside, the first time the older sister had entered the shed that Sarah had built. Margaret walked slowly, looking at the walls, the roof, the stone floor. There was a quietness about her that Sarah hadn't seen before, as if the place demanded it. She stopped at the brick with the tile manufacturer's stamp, the same one Nathan had run his hand over days before. "What stamp is that?" "From the tile works where the tiles I found came from," Sarah explained. "And the tiles, where are they?" "In museums, historical restorations, research collections." Margaret kept staring at the brick. "So you didn't keep them?" "I kept the money. And what mattered most to me?" She looked at the walls around her. "This place." Her sister was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something Sarah didn't expect. Dad would have liked seeing this. Sarah felt her chest tighten in a good way. He would have, she agreed. They had coffee, talked about small things, old memories, the dog they had as kids, a recipe their mother used to make that neither of them had quite memorized. They didn't fix everything. There was no way to fix everything in one morning. But there was a beginning. And beginnings, Sarah knew, are what they seem to be, fragments of something larger still being built. When Margaret left, Sarah stood at the shed door watching the car disappear down the dirt road. The same path she travelled every morning before dawn, alone, with a cell phone flashlight and the quiet certainty that what everyone else discarded had value. It hadn't been easy. Nothing had been easy. It had been humiliating to ask the man who laughed at her. It had been exhausting to work alone in the first weeks with her body aching and the neighbours watching with that mix of pity and curiosity. It had been painful, the fight with her sister, the sleepless nights when the lawsuit was filed, the uncertainty of not knowing if Edward would hold up under the pressure. And it had been lonely, very lonely. But there were also the conversations with Mrs. Hazel by the side of the road early in the morning, the imperfect but real loyalty of Edward, who chose to be honest rather than convenient, the arrival of Lydia, who saw in the pieces the same thing she had seen, something the world was about to lose without knowing it. The voice of Mrs. Gladys saying that what others don't value is what holds the most worth. Tyler showing up uninvited to say his uncle was wrong. And there was the sign at the entrance to the shed, Harrison Supply Co. Her father's last name burned into the hardwood she had pulled from the rubble herself. Sarah went back inside. She had work to do. Abigail would be arriving in half an hour. Mrs. Gladys was coming later. There was a truckload of material to receive, sort, and organize. It was Monday, and it had all the makings of a good day. She grabbed the leather apron from the hook on the wall, tied it behind her, and went to work. The end. This was a story that touched our hearts. Now tell us what you thought. Do you believe that what we are taught when we are young can change who we become? Leave it in the comments, hit like, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories like this one.